Proxima Centauri is a low-mass star that is part of the southern Centaurus constellation. The star is 4.24 light-years away from Earth. If you had a powerful enough laser, it would take the beam of light 4.24 years to get to the star. When you look up at the star, you are actually perceiving it as it was 4 years ago. The current fastest moving object made by man is the original Voyager probe. It is traveling over 35,000 miles per hour, and even at such an extreme velocity, it would take thousands of years to reach the star. The only practical way to get there is via faster-than-light travel, or FTL for short. According to Einstein, a fundamental rule of the universe is nothing but light itself can go that fast. The year was 2037, and that was the year we broke that rule, but at what cost? My name is James Anderson. I have been in the Air Force for 15 years, and it's always been said I was the best man they ever had. 2 years ago, I got an invitation from NASA to take part in a groundbreaking project. NASA was always a dream of mine. As a boy, I had always dressed up as an astronaut for Halloween and read basically all the books on them and the history of spaceflight. Joining the Air Force was the next best thing, and I ended up enjoying it a lot. I was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base as a test pilot for experimental fighters. The director of the project went by the name of Dr. Robert Butler. Robert was a tall, ginger man with a brain that would make even Einstein envious. Robert was the person who personally invited me to partake in his project. I accepted almost instantly when he called, and we set up a meeting to discuss details. The meeting place was a nondescript office building in the middle of Bethesda, Maryland. Robert's office was probably the cleanest room I had ever been in. He had a huge mahogany desk with a computer monitor that spanned almost half the desk on the corner. Behind him was a bookshelf full of books and miniature model aircraft. A pleasant autumn aroma filled the air from the incense he had burning in the other side of the room. Robert sat me down with a handshake and started, "Hello James, thank you for meeting with me today." "Thank you for having me. I'm excited to explore the opportunities in front of me," I responded eagerly. "Let's get the formalities out of the way so we can get down to business. I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement as this project is classified top secret," he continued. Robert slid me a thick document. As I suspected, it was the aforementioned agreement. I had signed thousands of these in the past, so I knew the drill. It basically said that if you discussed the project with anyone outside its scope, it was considered treason. I promptly signed the document with the expensive fountain pen. He had on his desk, half expecting him to leap out of his seat, telling me it was a display piece only. He didn't. Passing the document back to him and returning the pen, I thanked him and asked, "So, what is this groundbreaking project you speak about? Are you familiar with the theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre?" Robert asked with a curious expression. "I have read about him. He theorized a way to travel faster than light, but that theory was disproved a long time ago," I retorted. Robert sat back in his chair and went on. "What if I told you we recently revised his work and put it into practice?" Another question popped into my head. Miguel's FTL engine required significant power to function. Nothing in the world can create that much energy. "Yes, James, legitimate question. The scientists at the CERN Large Hadron Collider have been able to find a way to produce large amounts of antimatter. We have produced enough for a trip to Proxima Centauri, and back with a little extra," he answered. "So you've built a ship?" I asked. "Yes, we're calling it the Trieste, after the submersible piloted by Jacques Piccard that dove into the deepest depths of the ocean. It seemed the most appropriate," Robert replied. "I was humbled to be a part of something so much bigger than myself. I would have a chance to shape the future of mankind and affect many generations ahead of me." My heart started beating rapidly as I inquired, "How fast does it go?" According to our calculations, the Trieste has a max velocity of 32.47 times the speed of light, and you're going to be her pilot," he answered as if waiting for this question the whole time. Before I could ask the date of the flight, he handed me a contract that outlined the whole project. Upon signing the contract, Robert set me up with living accommodations and held out his hand. I shook it and left to move into the apartment he provided for me. After I settled in for a week, Robert invited me back to a spacious conference room to meet the others who would join me on the pioneering flight. Robert called 4 people into a line, each at the top of their respective fields and eager to change history. The first I was introduced to was engineer, Dr. Pravina Cook. Pravina designed and helped construct the reactor and FTL drive. She was a shorter woman, maybe just over 5 feet with long dark hair, in her 30s. What she lacks in height, she makes up for in intelligence. The next person I was introduced to was Dr. Haruto Moon. Dr. Moon was the medical doctor. He was tall, with short hair and a suit. Haruto was recently in the running to become Surgeon General, so NASA jumped at the opportunity to invite him. Then I met the chief scientist, Dr. Elizabeth Murphy. Elizabeth was one of the most beautiful women I've ever set my eyes upon. Her eyes were like diamonds. My gaze was transfixed on her smiling face before the man next to her cleared his throat. I snapped out of it and shook her hand and his. The man was the commanding officer of the Trieste, Colonel Edward Thompson. Thompson didn't look anything like the colonels I've worked with over the years. He was short and thin, so not very intimidating. I showed him the proper respect nonetheless. Before our handshake was finished, he leaned down to my ear and whispered, "I saw how you looked at Elizabeth. That's not what this mission is about, so if you would kindly keep your dick in your pants, this will all go ever so smoothly." I nodded before joining him in the line. Robert handed us each a glass of champagne and gave a toast to New Horizons. We all clinked our glasses and socialized. The next day was orientation. We all met in the same conference room. It was that day I finally got to see the Trieste. Although it was only a render on the wall, it looked like I was looking at the real thing. At the front of the craft was a large spherical command structure, probably where we controlled everything. Also inside the sphere, behind the sphere was what looked like a communications array. Then there was the reactor sandwiched between 2 vast rings. The rings were the main component of the FTL drive. Behind that, at the direct aft of the ship, were the main engines for standard propulsion. Flanking the reactor were 2 cylindrical tanks for the fuel. One had antimatter and the other tank contained matter. Those 2 substances emit vast amounts of energy when combined. The reactor controlled that and converted it to energy. Robert began by explaining why he chose Proxima Centauri. As you may already know, Proxima Centauri is the closest star to Earth other than the Sun. This makes it an excellent candidate for this project. That's not the only reason we chose it though. For a little over 40 years, that star has been emitting bursts of ultra-high energy radio waves. When analyzed, the signal is random in nature, basically bursts of static. Don't stars emit all kinds of waves? I questioned. Yes, James, you are correct. The remarkable thing about these ones is they happen every hour on the dot. If that wasn't strange enough, every burst is completely identical, he continued. The room fell silent as everyone was in a state of shock. Robert chuckled. That was my exact reaction. Your task is to travel to the star and use the equipment you bring along to study it, and find out what causes the signals. I smiled when I saw the joy in Elizabeth's face. Stars were her area of study. Robert began answering more questions we had. Some important particulars stood out to me. The Trieste is still under construction and orbit. It will take 1.5 months to reach the star at max speed, and we are scheduled to depart in 1 year after vigorous training. Our orientation ended and I went home. NASA put my body to its extreme upper limit over that year. I had never been tested like that, not even during my time in the Air Force. One of the simulations, they put me in a chair attached to a spinner that spun incredibly fast to simulate G-forces. Another time, I was put in a chamber for several hours under high atmospheric pressure to see how I responded to the change. After many tests like this, me and my shipmates were ready to go. The launch day had arrived. This was a top-secret mission, so the trip to the Soyuz rocket that would take us up was oddly void of reporters. I didn't have anyone to say bye to, which was one of the reasons I was selected, as there was every chance the ship could just explode. The Soyuz rumbled to life as it violently carried us up. I had never been so uncomfortable in such a comfortable seat. Eventually the rumbling stopped and I felt without weight. Moments later, Elizabeth screamed with excitement. "Look." I watched out the window. Before me was the Trieste, in all her magnificence. It was surrounded by the scaffolding used to help in the construction. The capsule docked with the ship and we boarded. Before me was the command center and the finest technology that humanity had to offer. At the front was a single grand console, my console, used for navigation. The ship oddly had gravity, although I didn't know how it worked. I hiked across the spacious room to my console so I could examine it. To my left was a small joystick like you'd find on an arcade cabinet. It was used to control the reaction control thrusters that steered the ship. There was a camera system there so I could see where we were going. Directly in front of me was an extensive celestial map so I could see where we were and plot courses. Overlaying the map were the controls for the FTL drive, which were simple. Pravina handled the complicated aspects naturally. Finally, to my right was a simple throttle for the main engines and a multifunction display for factors like power levels and velocity. Colonel Thomas shouted, "All right, everyone, to your stations." Pravina and Elizabeth took to their stations on either side of me. Elizabeth's station slowed full access to the full suite of sensors and scanners installed on the ship. They allowed her to study the star. I don't know how to explain Pravina's console, as it was too complex for me. My job at that moment was to make sure that the navigation system was aligned and the engines were ready to fire so we could head out. We spent a couple hours preparing as the scaffolding around the ship was taken away. Robert called over the radio. "All right, everything looks good from our end. Proceed whenever you're ready." "Thank you, Robert. We will contact you when we are in position to go light speed," replied the colonel. "James, take us out," he ordered. I tapped on my console, firing up the engines, and the ship gained speed. We could not perceive it due to the artificial gravity. The ship needed to be far from Earth in case of disaster. If the ship were to go up, it would be equivalent to 500 megatons of TNT. The engines were incredibly powerful. On one camera it gave me a view behind the ship, and the Earth was visibly getting smaller. Eventually, we got out of range. I cut the engines and let the Trieste coast. "We are in position, sir," I informed Thomas. He relayed the information to control. "This is it, people. Charge the rings, James," he instructed. I started the charge sequence and the ship began to hum as the rings roared to life. Looking at the readout, it read 2 minutes to charge. 2 minutes to charge, I shouted excitedly. There was an atmosphere of anxiety and excitement. Nobody there wasn't worried. My panel turned green as the coils finished charging. The colonel knew this and had a seat. After the click from his harness, he addressed the crew. "Whatever happens, you all have done this country proud. James, engage." I had the biggest smile on my face as I nodded and did as instructed. We heard a loud burst of energy. Colors dazzled our eyes as we gazed out the front window. What followed was an unnerving silence. I came to my senses and studied at the panel in front of me. "Holding steady at 24.5 C. We are stable," I exclaimed. A wave of relief washed over all of us before we started celebrating. What I saw out the window is hard to explain. It was like we were flying through a blue tunnel of light. Pravina promptly checked the drive for any issues. She found none. We all congregated in the mess area for a meal while Dr. Moon examined himself and the rest of us for any negative effects of our transition to light speed. To his amazement, we all looked perfectly healthy. Dinner was disgusting freeze-dried chicken, or what looked like chicken and tasted like rubber. Despite the horrible cuisine, we were all happy as could be. To us at the time, we just made history. It was the life goal of every human being. We were proud. Soon it was time to sleep for the long trip. Thompson ushered the crew into the sleeping chamber and we each got into our respective pods. The pods were programmed to wake us up 5 hours before we reached Proxima Centauri. Pravina checked over the systems methodically before getting into her pod. She didn't want there to be any problems while we were sound asleep. As my pod closed, I felt claustrophobic before gently drifting into a deep slumber. I awoke seemingly minutes later to a blinding light. Dr. Moon and Elizabeth with those beautiful eyes were standing above me. She smiled saying, "We're here, James." I slowly sat up and got out of my pod. The other 2 crewmates were awake as well. Dr. Moon gave me a pill to help me recover from the extended rest, and I got out of my pod. Thomas asked me where we were. The trudge to my console was a little awkward as it felt like I was learning to walk for the first time again. The console read an ETA of 4 hours, 13 minutes, and 53 seconds. I turned to Dr. Moon. I thought we were supposed to wake at 5 hours, not 4 1/4. You're right. We had a little trouble with your pod. It wouldn't open, he replied with a concerned expression. The crew and I spent the remaining 4 hours checking systems and getting food in our bodies. It was fish this time, equally rubbery as the chicken. Eventually it came time to shut down the drive as we had arrived. I shut it down and the ship came to a stop. There was a blinding light out the window. I was looking at another star. It just sunk in, the gravity of what we had just accomplished. I don't think I was the only one with that feeling. Thompson shouted an instruction. Bring us into orbit of the star, James. With a permanent smile on my face, I acknowledged and used my console to fire up the engines and put us into orbit. Are we able to filter out all the blinding light? Thompson asked unanimously. Elizabeth spoke up. The window has one. I'll activate it. My heart hit the deck plating with an audible thud when she activated the filter. I observed the star being covered in green, vine-like structures. It almost seemed organic. Proxima Centauri looked alive. It was visibly throbbing. I was visibly terrified at the sight. What the hell? That's not what a star is supposed to look like, Thompson said, shocked. Elizabeth tapped her panel with determination. She concluded that with spectrographic analysis, the star was indeed organic. There was nothing in her analysis that pointed to it being a star of any classification other than the blinding light it emitted. How could we not have seen this without instruments on Earth? I concluded it was somehow able to trick them from that vast distance, Elizabeth noted with a puzzled expression. I don't understand how this is possible. How long until the next radio burst? Thomas asked. 5 minutes, she replied as she checked her panel. As we waited, I was a nervous wreck. 5 minutes came and went. The radio pulse came and went as well. I felt a slight tingling sensation, but it was harmless. We were monitoring the signal, and it was the same as previously recorded pulses according to Elizabeth. What do you make of all this, Dr. Moon? The colonel asked without diverting his gaze. Moon didn't respond. I could hear soft, high-pitched wheezing coming from his direction. The colonel noticed too and turned around. Dr. Moon was completely motionless. Assuming he was just daydreaming, Thompson shouted, Dr. Moon. What happened next was the most disturbing, frightening thing I've ever witnessed. That's saying something coming from a soldier like myself. Moon started convulsing violently before slowly changing into something. His arms, his legs, his fingers, his toes, his neck all grew to double their length. Sharp teeth descended from his gums, and existing teeth broke into sharp points. His jaw disconnected from his skull, giving him a gaping, terrifying maw. One of the panels behind him gave me a reflected view of his back. His back split apart, exposing his spine with each vertebrae having long, jagged spikes protruding from like them a dinosaur. The same sort of spikes were also protruding from all joints of his body. His skin turned a dark green color and was now ripped, exposing bone and a powerful muscular structure. There was nothing recognizable left. I sprinted at Elizabeth and grabbed her arm as we raced to safety. Pravina followed, but Colonel Thomas, rest his soul, wasn't so lucky. Moon, or what we thought was Moon, lunged at him with a high-pitched, unnatural screech, thrusting both arms into the colonel's chest. Aided by the spikes that grew on the knuckles, Thomas didn't make a sound, just went limp, with his arms dangling below him. His motionless body was lifted off the ground. I winced with horror. There was an explosion of blood and gore as the creature separated its arms, ripping already deceased Colonel Thomas in half. His blood-soaked insides were scattered all over the room. In all my years of military service, I've never seen something even remotely more disturbing. With no time to mourn our fallen comrade, we moved into the mess and closed the door, locking it. The two girls were sobbing. None of us wanted to talk about what just happened or what caused it. Pravina noted, still sobbing, "We need to kill it." Nobody ever guessed to pack weapons on this ship as it was a mission of exploration and this occurrence would never show up in any manual. The three of us collected ourselves and I cracked open the door. Moon was pacing the room and noticed me. He produced another loud screech and charged me. I got back inside just in time and he started banging on the door relentlessly. "Try and find something I can use as a weapon," I said frantically. "We may not need one. The main airlock is the room with it. There is a console in the communications room opposite this door that can open it," Pravina said, still shaken with fear. I opened the door and the creature was in the middle of the room, standing above the colonel as if it was admiring its latest kill. I threw a piece of metal past it, and the creature jumped at where it hit the ground. I gathered up all the strength and determination I could muster and bolted for the communications room door. The creature saw me and got within inches, but I made it, and sealed the door behind me. Moon, as if he knew what was about to happen, pounded much louder than before. Almost desperate, I used the auxiliary console to increase the pressure and blow out the airlock. The environment outside the door sounded like a wind tunnel. The pounding ceased. I could hear it frantically claw at the ground before a loud puff sound as it flew out helplessly. I resealed the airlock and pressurized. Upon opening the door, both the creature and the colonel were gone, with deep claw marks in the ground and around the airlock. To my horror, I looked up and it had completely trashed the command deck. All the consoles were destroyed with no way to use them. We were dead in the water with no way to control the ship. I called the girls out as it was safe. They both took on my shocked face when presented with the carnage. "Can we activate the drive from the reactor room?" I asked Pravina. "Yes, but we would have no navigational control," she replied skeptically. With haste, we made our way to the reactor control room. The room was dissimilar from the rest of the ship. It had an industrial design. Pravina did her magic to try and charge the rings before another burst. There was no way to know which one of us would change into that thing. Her fingers tapped away at an inhuman pace. She froze. No, Pravina screamed. "What?" Elizabeth and I responded in unison. "The rings aren't charging. The creature must have hit one when he flew out of the airlock," she said with a defeated look on her face. I felt as if the entire universe was trying to kill us. The three of us went to a window. We were shocked to discover that there was a deep gash on the side of one of the rings. That meant the only chance we had was the main engines. We could get far enough away and try to fix the rings with a spacewalk. We had no way of knowing how far the pulse had an effect, and wasted no time starting them up from the reactor room. Pravina put all available power through the engines, including the power from life support. 30 minutes later, we were going fast enough that I could perceive the organic star drifting away slowly. There were 15 minutes until the next burst. The three of us took shelter with nothing left to do and separated ourselves with doors between us, just in case we were not far enough away from the star. The engines were still going. We were keeping in constant contact using the internal comm system. Elizabeth monitored for the burst. The three of us had never been so scared in our lives, as we now knew what was potentially about to happen. Our fate was inevitable. The burst came and went. The two started sobbing again. As far as I could tell at the moment, we were all safe. I broke down with relief as it was one issue we no longer had to deal with. One of them stopped crying. "Elizabeth," I called out. "I'm here, James. I'm here," Elizabeth cried. That same screech came out of the speakers. It was so loud, my eardrums were in searing pain. I called for Pravina. It was already too late for her. She was in the pod room. Elizabeth was the only thing on my mind at that time. I had a clear path to get to her. She was in the communications room. I went over and joined her there. We had an hour left. The two of us knew there was no chance of repairing the ring without Pravina. Pravina started pounding on her door as the transformation was complete. I am writing this from that room with Elizabeth. I don't know if my story will reach Earth. Even if it did, it would be too late for us as it takes a whole 4 years with light-speed communications. We are just too far away. Pravina just busted out of the pod room. She knows where we are and has started trying to do the same to this door. I don't know how long we have left. I don't know what will get us first, Pravina or the next burst. All I know is we don't want to die in either fashion. I'm contemplating evacuating the air from this room. Elizabeth agreed and started sobbing uncontrollably. I am embracing her with one arm and writing this with the other. The air is getting thin. Humans can survive about 6 minutes without oxygen. It is an agonizing death, but it is far better than the alternative. I do not regret going on this mission, neither does Elizabeth. We are fortunate to make our world proud. If you are reading this message, please stay away from Proxima Centauri. It is not what it seems. The room is now completely void of oxygen. Elizabeth has gone unconscious. I am devastated, but I know I won't be that way for much longer. Only one thing left to do: send.
I had been unemployed for months when I saw the job offer for a planner with no experience required. When I called, they told me to come down that night. The office was in the middle of 2 crumbling apartment complexes with gang graffiti all over the walls and ripped open bags of trash strewn across the alleys. Other than a few homeless people and hooded figures standing on the corner, the entire area looked deserted. I entered the cracked stucco building and followed the signs for Avency Planning. On the 2nd floor, I knocked on the door. It opened up with a loud squeal. On every wall stood posters for old horror and sci-fi movies, from Alien to Halloween to Predator, Phantasm, and Hellraiser. A couple dull, incandescent bulbs barely illuminated the room. A large desk with an ancient woman behind it took up the majority of the room. She motioned at the seat across from her, and I sat. "Mr. Bellingham? Jason Bellingham?" she asked me in a soft tone. I nodded. "I am Dorothea Lamb. This will be a quick session. You will be paid per task. First, we need you to fill out some surveys." I nodded genially at this, and she gave me a clipboard filled with papers, directing me back out into the lobby to fill it out. I was expecting the generic name, number, address type forms, and that was how it started out. But it quickly became weird. "Do you believe in God?" one question asked. A checklist ran next to it. Yes or no. "Do you think hell is real? Would you ever commit suicide? Do you think demons can possess your soul? Do you wish you were never born?" I stared blankly at the sheet for a minute, wondering if there were candid cameras filming me as part of some joke. I filled it out honestly and returned the sheet to the woman. She scanned it briefly, then put it in the top drawer of her desk, pulling a key from her pocket and locking the drawer behind it. "You're hired," she said, smiling widely at me. Her beady brown eyes studied me over her huge Cheshire cat grin. "Can you start training immediately?" I nodded, feeling a small, tight pit of anxiety in my stomach as her smile never faltered. Her eyes looked like tiny black holes in the overly bright fluorescent lighting of the room. Something felt wrong, but I really needed the money. I hadn't had a job in months, and my savings account was already overdrafted. If I didn't pay my rent by the end of next week, the landlord said she would begin eviction proceedings immediately. "Absolutely," I said, offering her a wan smile. She smacked her meaty hands down on the desk, making me jump. "Great," she said, still showing far too many teeth in her disconcerting grin. "Follow me to the training center." She got up quickly, moving much faster than an obese woman like her would appear to be able, and motioned for me to come. I followed her down a hallway from her office, the carpet feeling wet and squelchy beneath my sneakers. The fluorescent lights flickered in overly bright strobes, making me feel nauseated and disoriented. Mrs. Lamb seemed totally unaffected by any of it. She walked with a grace unusual for someone who looked like she broke the 300-pound mark. She turned suddenly, opening a random door on the right that looked just like the endless lines of doors on both sides of the hall. It had no marking or number on it to differentiate it, but when she opened it, I saw it lead into a garage. Men and women in identical uniforms stood in lines next to vans labeled Celestial Pathway. They all had on pure white pants and button-down shirts for the men, or skirts and blouses for the women. Not a single spot or stain marred the cloth on any of them. They all stared at me like mannequins, with identical blank, smiling expressions on all of their faces. Goosebumps popped out all over my skin, and a thin sheen of sweat began to gather on my forehead as my gut told me to get the hell out of there. But I really needed the money, so I ignored it and continued forward. From the corner of the room, a man stepped forward in an extremely expensive black suit from Dolce & Gabbana. It was professionally tailored and had a silky sheen that glimmered under the bright lights overhead. His pale gray eyes stared at me, as cold as iron. His white hair perfectly coiffed, his skin smooth and totally free of wrinkles, despite his advanced age. He handed me a business card. I looked down at its embossed words, frowning. Caravar Avenzi, businessman, entrepreneur, enlightened being. Below that, it had his phone number, fax number, and email address. Hi there, I said awkwardly, holding out my hand. My name is Jason Bellingham. He shook it, his hand radiating warmth, his grip feeling like steel as he crushed my hand under his. Caravar Avenzi, he said simply, giving my hand a single pump before releasing it. You can call me Caravar, however. I am the owner and operator of this building, as well as many other businesses in the area. Most importantly, however, I operate a spiritual group here, one we call the Celestial Pathway. He motioned at the vans for emphasis, showing off the professionally wrapped, massive letters that covered all sides of the vehicles. First of all, he said, pulling a clipboard from out of nowhere and handing it over to me, we just need to finish the formalities. This here is your NDA, which states you will never speak of what you see while working here to anyone. And this is your employment contract, $27 an hour to start, and potentially more later if everything works out for the best. My mouth dropped at this. Most of the temp and non-degree jobs around here paid anywhere from $13 to $20 an hour. $27 an hour was a life-changing amount for me right now. All the red flags I had noticed in this place were brushed away by my mind as a flood of hope took over. Thank you so much, I said quickly, excited, feeling my heart fluttering in my chest. You have no idea how much this job means to me. Caravar smiled politely at me, waiting for me to finish. Then he produced a blindfold from the inner pocket of his jacket. Put this on, he said bluntly. We must go to the worksite now, or at least, you must go to the worksite. I have important things to attend to first. I held the blindfold in my right hand, like a dead fish limply strewn over my fingers. Put it on, he repeated insistently, his voice turning cold. I did as he commanded, a rising trepidation battling the need for money in my mind. A strong hand tightened around my arm, and I felt the stinging pain of a needle going into my neck. Then I lost consciousness. I woke up an indeterminate time later feeling pine needles and twigs underneath my fingers, the smell of evergreens giving a pungent aroma to the air. Mixed in with that sweet pine smell was an undertone of rotting meat, urine, and liquefied shit. I sat up quickly, thinking that I was blind for a moment, before remembering the blindfold and ripping it off. What I saw in front of me horrified me. A few 100 feet away, across a grassy field, a pile of nude bodies was stacked in a pyramid, legs and arms hanging out like loose stitches in an unfinished needlework project. The white-clad members of the organization stood next to a couple of the celestial pathway vans on the dirt road between me and the pile of corpses. The largest member stepped forward, and I recognized her instantly as Dorothea Lamb. "Good evening, Mr. Bellingham," she said sweetly, her beady eyes narrowing as she gazed down at me. "I'm glad to see you return to the land of the living. The time of your training has come." The rest of the organization members, which I was now beginning to suspect were actually cult members, stared at me silently, slight identical grins marring their otherwise expressionless faces. A black man with a shaved head stepped forward from the cult members, motioning for me to follow him as he turned and began walking towards the pile of corpses. Having no other choice, my eyes downcast as I walked past the expressionless faces, I followed him. Next to the rotting bodies, I saw two things that sent a sense of shock through me: an industrial-sized wood chipper and a black hole in the ground, about 5 feet across and perfectly level with the grass and dirt around it. As we walked closer, though, I realized that the hole was not a hole in the traditional sense. It shimmered and sent up sparks of iridescent light. The surface of it resembled an oil stain, the blackness mixing with the dying light of the day to form rainbows that shifted and morphed into one another. Behind that blackness, I saw what looked like humanoid shapes swimming and dancing. But as I tried to focus on them, my head began to pound, and they seemed to disappear or swim away. "I don't recommend you stare too deeply into that portal," the black man said with a growl. "Sometimes it can hypnotize people, and those it hypnotizes have been known to jump in from time to time. We never see them again." Tearing my gaze away, I looked up at him. "What's your name, friend?" I asked, trying to be as nice as possible, hoping I would still get out of here alive. "You call me Kay," he said, extending his hand. "In our religion, the monks and nuns give up our names. Only the workers like Mrs. Lamb or the leaders like Caravara Venzi keep theirs." I shook his hand as he talked, making eye contact. He didn't smile. His shaved head reflected the light of the sunset as the sun began to disappear behind the trees. "Now, listen up, because I am only going to say this once. Your job is to dispose of the traitors." He pointed to the pile of bodies behind us, "and to feed the asuras." With this, he pointed to the shimmering black hole. "The asuras don't like full bodies, so we provide them with assistance." He pointed to the wood chipper. "Any questions?" I had many, many questions, but I wasn't going to say that. "What are the asuras?" I asked. I thought he would slap me, but instead, he simply stared daggers at me before responding. "They are from the stars," he said. "They came down from heaven, and they will return to it, bringing us with them. But until that time comes, we need to feed them and keep the organization pure. The celestial pathway is literally that, the pathway to the to heaven for all of us, you included, if you choose to accept what is given. Now, get to work. I hate to admit it, but I did get to work. Kay turned on the wood chipper with a roar, and I grabbed the first body and dragged it over. He didn't want to touch it, or help me in any way. I had the feeling none of the cult members liked to touch the bodies, which is very likely why they hired me in the first place. The body was still fresh, the blue eyes staring blankly up at me, as if asking, why? Grunting, I pushed the feet up into the conveyor belt of the wood chipper, then grabbed the shoulders and lifted it. The belt did the rest of the work, carrying the body into the interior machinery. With a wet, crushing sound, the body began to disassemble. Pieces of bone and flesh began to roar out into the black, shimmering hole. I heard a harmonic song of joy from the hole as the slurry disappeared into it. And the opening seemed to expand outwards as the beings inside fed on the human meat. Kay indicated for me to continue, so I did. Some of the bodies were in worse shape than the first, the skin sloughing off in my hands, the bloated flesh releasing rancid-smelling gases that made me gag and cough. There were men and women of all races and ages, and even a few children. Under the baleful gaze of Kay, with all the other cult members ready to come at a moment's notice, I knew I had no choice but to continue my task until it was completed. I only hoped they would let me go home. Once I got to my 7th body, things started to go wrong. I picked up the fresh-looking body of a young Asian woman, but her eyes flew open. She was covered in blood and gore, but apparently not dead. Her breath began to come in heaving gasps as she looked straight at me, whispering, "Please, help me." Instinctively, I dropped her like I had accidentally picked up a poisonous snake. I almost started to scream, but at that moment, Kay roughly pushed past me, pulling a syringe from his pocket and shoving it into her neck. Then he indicated that I should continue. "I can't continue," I wailed plaintively. "She's still alive. What if other ones are still alive too? They are dead to us, so therefore they are dead to the world. We are the path of life. We are the celestial path. Now move these bodies made of meat, you maggot." My head downcast, I did as he said. Grabbing her by the ankles, I began to pull the naked body towards the wood chipper. I didn't notice any breathing anymore from the woman, and I hoped for her sake she was dead. Out of pity, though, I put her into the conveyor belt head first, wondering if any of the others were actually alive when I put the bodies in. I shuddered at the very thought, my stomach turning in quick, nauseous flips. But I knew that if I refused, they would kill me. I could see it in the eyes of Kay and all the other cult members. Actually, speaking of the other cult members, what were they all doing here? I wondered to myself. Sneaking a peek in that direction, the dying light of the day illuminated a horrifying scene. They were gathered in a circle around a shimmering black being 30 feet tall. Its skin sent off rainbows, as if made of oil spots on the pavement, and it had no features, no eyes, no mouth, no hair, nothing besides the human shape of a black behemoth. I saw the cult members praying on their knees to it, and as they murmured, the being seemed to grow and solidify. The air around it cracked with electricity, throwing off sparks of light in all directions. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt hypnotized, until Kay came from behind me and smacked me in the back of the head. "Don't stare at the asuras," he said to me. "You think you are worthy to even look upon it? You aren't worthy to lick the dirt from its feet." I nodded silently, then went back to work, dragging more bodies to the wood chipper. The hole continued to grow until I wondered if it would suck in the wood chipper itself eventually. The circumference of it was only a few feet away by this point, and the hole had grown to over 30 feet across. Looking down into it, I saw the oily black beings beneath the surface were writhing and dancing at an amazingly fast speed, almost too fast for my eye to see anything more than a constant blur. Kay came up beside me, looking down into the hole for a second. I pretended to walk back to the pile of bodies, but I kept a close eye on him. He continued to stare down, hypnotized, and I knew this might be my only chance to lose him and escape. I got a running start from 10 feet behind him, trying to sprint as quietly as I could. Despite this, he heard my footsteps and began to turn as I plowed into him at full speed. The half-turn ended up being to my advantage, as his legs tangled as he went flying into the black opening. His mouth opened in a silent scream as hundreds of black arms, all covered in that oily sheen of rainbows and colors, flew up and grabbed him, pulling him in different directions. His body tore into pieces, then sunk beneath the surface. I took the chance and began to run towards the forest, away from the cult members praying to the black god behind me. As I passed the pile of corpses, I saw some of them stirring, trying to fight their way out from the tangle of arms and legs, rising up from the rotting bodies that surrounded them. Once I was in the woods, I just ran randomly, changing directions multiple times. I was caught in pricker bushes and my skin torn, but due to the adrenaline, I barely felt it. Eventually, I heard the roaring of traffic and followed it to a highway where I flagged down a car who called the police. I told them the entire sordid tale, and they gave me the benefit of the doubt, even allowing me to show them to the original building where I had interviewed. But now, it was abandoned. All the posters and desks gone. All the vans missing from the garage. Not a person was in sight. They said they'd follow up with me if they found anything. But that was weeks ago, and I never heard anything back from them. But I did hear from my old friend, Caravar Avensi, businessman, entrepreneur, enlightened being. At least, he sent me a piece of mail. It was a check for the hours I had worked. True to his word, he had paid me $27 an hour for the entire time I had disposed of those bodies for them, even including payment for the time taken to interview and travel to the site. And yes, I did deposit the check. After all, I really needed the money.